The following program is shot in 4K high dynamic range and broadcast in high definition from Capital Broadcasting Company.
Brevard was what I would call a quintessential small town. I like to say that my friends and I owned that town.
Please, Mr. Wabbit, go on back to the forest where you belong.
On Saturday mornings, we'd get up, maybe watch a few cartoons, and then we'd be out the door on our bicycles, riding all over town. For me, it was just a great place to grow up. Everybody knew everybody. When I was 9 years old, I was in my front yard. It was in the fall, which is my favorite time of year. The leaves were falling. I just decided that I wanted to sneak out and just walk around town. Young boys do things like that. This guy comes up behind me and says, "Hey, you want to earn some money?" To best of my recollection, this is about where it happened.
What happened on that October night in 1965 would change Knight Chamberlain forever. After sneaking out of his house, he walked to a downtown Brevard newsstand.
I remember, looking and thinking, gee, I wish I had money to buy something to eat and drink.
Instead, Knight walked over to get a drink from the water fountain in front of the courthouse. That's where the stranger approached him with an offer to earn $5 to stack some oil cans.
So I was like, wow, $5. Okay. 9-year-old kid, had never had any kind of situation. Nobody talked about stranger danger or anything like that.
Knight began walking with the stranger.
And I remember starting to get just a little uneasy because the street lights were, a little further apart. Something just started to not feel right. All of a sudden, the guy grabs my shoulder kind of roughly, shoves me into this wooded area. We got into a clearing. Looking back, I'm guessing he'd probably taken kids there before. His voice became much more menacing, and he basically said, "All right, get down on the ground, take your clothes off, do what I say, or I'm gonna slit your throat." And he pulled out a knife and showed me. I'm pretty sure I remember crying, starting to whimper and say, "I want to go home, please let me go home," whatever. That's when he assaulted me, frontally and from behind. We got up and I pulled my clothes back on, and I was just kind of in a daze, as you might imagine, in shock. We went back out to the street again and started walking back toward town. He took me back to this newsstand and asked me if I wanted something to drink and to eat, like we were buddies. He said, "We should get together again sometime, maybe go to a movie." Like nothing had happened, and whatever, I mumbled something, and then, he just walked off. I do not remember walking home. I don't remember waking up the next morning.
Knight told a friend what happened. The friend told a neighbor who came knocking on the door of Knight's home the next morning. His mother answered the door.
And I just remember this scream that I'd never heard from my mother in my life, and that scared me even more.
Knight's mother took him to the police.
The officer who was interviewing me used a coarse description to ask me what had happened to me, and I was horrified by that question because it was something that I had never heard before, and particularly because he said it in front of my mother.
Police caught Knight's attacker a couple of days later. Meantime, Knight and his mother tried to return to normal life.
My mother didn't talk about it. She had a saying that she used, that which cannot be cured must be endured. Basically, she just allowed me to be a kid. You know, I would still go out, ride my bike all over. I didn't sneak out of the house for a while, I have to admit.
The attacker's trial date came the following spring. Knight would have to testify against him.
I was just terrified that this was just gonna, the whole town was gonna know, and I was just so ashamed. I just felt the shame of, it kind of came crashing down on me at that point.
Knight could not bring himself to go into the courtroom.
I felt really guilty about the fact that they had to let this person go because I was too much of a coward. I considered myself a coward for not being able to testify.
Knight's mother remarried a few years later. She and her new husband moved the family to the Washington, D.C. area. They later decided to send Knight to a private boarding school near Hickory, North Carolina.
Because of my experience, I was very shy around girls.
But made many good friends and eventually found a girlfriend.
She had to kiss me first.
Knight says he had a little more confidence in college.
Just getting to college for me was a big deal.
After graduating, Knight became a journalist, working as a reporter for various newspapers across North Carolina. But he had some lingering scars from the assault, mostly deep feelings of insecurity.
To me, it just seemed like it manifested itself in an inability to stay at the same job for more than a year or two.
Knight changed jobs dozens of times. He married and had children. But after 29 years of marriage, his wife Sandy died of colon cancer. Knight had left work to care for her, but decided to go back to being a newspaper reporter after her death. Eventually, Knight decided to join an online dating site. He soon found Rosemary Taylor. Rosemary had lost her 7-year-old daughter to cancer and her husband to suicide just 2 years afterward. She had a warning for Knight.
This isn't going to be easy, for you. And I remember saying, well, I'm not looking for easy.
Neither was Rosemary. Knight told her about his childhood sexual assault early in their relationship.
Of course, I was horrified, just absolutely horrified. But to be able to put yourself out there as an adult and to talk about what happened, I think is very, very brave.
I usually used to make bread when I was first out of college.
But it is good when you make it.
Knight and Rosemary married a little over a year after they met.
We both kind of had this attitude that because of what we'd been through, that saying, don't sweat the small stuff, and it's all small stuff. It changes your perspective about what's important in life.
I'm here to see that the denial and ignorance of this very real crisis is unacceptable for a very personal reason.
Later, how Knight found a way to heal his wounds. But next, the revelation that his own stepbrother had also been sexually abused as a child.
I made a promise that I would keep that secret, and so I did.
Michael Mack grew up in a devout Catholic family in the Washington, D.C. area. He wanted to be a priest.
I wanted to be close to God, and it looked like to be a priest, that's as close as I could get. And so that was my aim.
When he was 10, Michael's mother was battling mental illness, so his father sent him and his siblings to live with a relative in Brevard for a school year. That's where he met Knight, who would later become his stepbrother. Knight and his family went to the Episcopal Church on Sundays, while Michael and his went to the Catholic Church. One Sunday after Mass, Michael was playing in the church's basement where Sunday school was held.
And then I saw that there was a piano shoved up against the wall, an old upright piano, and so I started playing on it. And while I was playing the piano, I looked up and I saw that Father Gordon was in the doorway. So I said, "Hi." And he said hi back and commented on my playing.
With his dad living in D.C. and only visiting every couple of weeks, Father Gordon had become a father figure to Michael.
And I just really appreciated being given this much attention by a man that I looked up to and a man that I wanted to be like, because I wanted to be a priest. And here was this priest who was taking a special interest in me.
Father Gordon told Michael he was making costumes for an Easter play.
He invited me to come up to the rectory and help him, and I was thrilled to do that because I wanted to be helpful.
Inside the rectory, Father Gordon was using sheets to make shepherds' costumes. Michael says Father Gordon explains to him that boys' costumes need more room just below the waist than girls' costumes do.
He wanted to make sure that I had enough room, and so he asked me to sit on the bed and that he could help if I pretended that he was a girl. And that was the first moment that I knew something was terribly wrong, because I was in 6th grade and no boy I knew kissed girls. And I don't know how long I was there. It seemed like forever. He said that this was going to be a secret between us and that I was very special, and so I needed to keep this secret. And so he gave me a quarter, and then he opened the door and he ushered me out, and I went back outside to my bike, and I felt like I was completely different now.
Michael left the Catholic Church physically that day and spiritually later.
It would be years before I told anybody. And really that's where the effects of what happened started to play out for me, because the first thing that it was a secret. With the beginning of my keeping that secret, it was like there was this little poison inside of me. I never really blamed him, I blamed myself. And that self-blame over time became a kind of self-hatred.
That led to depression, isolation, and suicidal thoughts. It also led to alcohol and drug abuse. But Michael eventually found a pathway to healing by opening up to therapists and to family and close friends. At age 48, Michael decided to find out more about Father Gordon. A Google search revealed that he had been arrested and convicted for a similar incident involving a child. He served prison time and was defrocked by the church. Michael also found out he was living near him just outside of Boston.
And that seemed to me like the hand of God. Because ever since I was a little boy, ever since after the abuse, I had this idea that someday I would contact him, someday I would have a conversation with him.
A conversation he hoped would help explain why Father Gordon did what he did. Michael found his phone number, but didn't have the nerve to go through with the call. So he decided to write a letter.
I wanted to make it clear in the letter that I was not holding anything against him, that it would just be really meaningful to me to have a conversation with him about what happened.
But it took him years to bring himself to mail it. And soon after he did, he got news about Father Gordon.
And I discovered, to my amazement and really to my horror, that he was just killed in a fire. And I can't believe it.
Michael decided to go to Father Gordon's funeral mass.
And as the Mass begins, I start to remember what it was about the Mass and what it was about the church that I so loved as a child.
Michael met several priests while attending the Mass. Later, on another Google search, he found an article about one of them.
There's an accuser who has said about him that he was part of a group of men that met in a house and played Pass Around the Boy. And for the first time in my life, I feel a sense of horror and outrage.
About a year later, Michael returned to Brevard and to the place where he was abused, just like Knight returned to the scene of his assault. The old Catholic church he attended was now a community arts center.
And I look up into what was the rectory window, and incredibly, there is an image of a boy.
It was a self-portrait a boy had done as part of a children's art show.
It just seems so striking to me because in my mind, there's only one boy that could be looking out that rectory window at me. It's sort of like I'm seeing myself look out at me as an adult as I look up at him as a child.
While in Brevard, Michael also reached out to a neighbor who had also abused him as a child. It was an effort to have the conversation he never had with Father Gordon. In their conversation, Michael found out the neighbor was living in isolation and poverty and suffering from mental illness.
My heart went out to this guy. And I really didn't feel like I needed to pursue this with him.
In his heart, Michael had forgiven him, and somewhat by proxy, he had forgiven Father Gordon too. He decided to go over to the new Catholic Church for confession. He told his entire story and expected some sort of penance from the priest.
And he says to me, "You've done your penance. Go in peace." And it felt to me like, yes. For 40 years, I'd been doing penance. I'd done my time with that. I didn't need to do that anymore.
The priest invited Michael to stay for Mass.
And the Mass begins, and the floodgates open up. I am crying for 40 years of my life. And I've never cried like that before in my life. But I understand even in this moment of release, where I feel like I'm releasing all of this pain of my life, that this is really just the beginning.
The beginning of forgiveness.
And so that's why I was able to ultimately return to the church and embrace it with all of its faults, with all of its warts.
And continue the process of healing.
And one of the things that has been so healing for me has been the telling of this story.
A riddle dangled between him and me. Was this the secret priests knew?
Next, Michael pens a play about this story, and Knight writes and speaks about his.
We walked by the church, but I never thought to ask God why He allowed this to happen.
To see Speaking the Unspeakable on demand anytime, go to WRALdocumentary.com. There you'll also find bonus content, including an in-depth podcast about Michael Mack's story, information on child sexual abuse, and advice from a leading psychiatrist about how to spot the signs and how to deal with the impact.
Many children don't show any signs.
The documentary and much of its bonus content can also be found on Roku, Amazon Fire, and Apple TV. In many ways, Knight Chamberlain and his stepbrother Michael Mack have led parallel lives.
The way that I see our lives as being parallel is that we both had this formative, traumatic experience, one that really shaped our years to come and our psyche in the years to come.
Each of them decided to tell their stories very publicly.
When the father opened the door to usher me out, when he raised his finger to his lips and swore me to a secret.
Michael's old secret is now the subject of a one-man play he wrote, produced, and performs. It's called Conversations with My Molester, A Journey of Faith. It tells the story of his abuse, finding forgiveness, and returning to the Catholic Church.
I began to have imaginary conversations with the Father, sometimes aloud, spoken to air, about what happened, what it meant, what it made me.
He pulled out a knife and unbuckled his belt with a demand that is seared into my memory.
Knight tells his story in a book he wrote called Sidestepping the Pit. The title is a reference to him surviving sexual abuse without depression or substance abuse and finding a way to forgive his attacker.
Why was I spared? In the quiet moments alone, I ask this question: how did I come to forgive him?
Knight also gives public talks about his experience, like this one recently in Asheville, where Michael joined him.
Each of us in different ways at different times have also come to recognize that forgiveness for us on our journey of healing has been an essential part of that healing.
And so has been having conversations about what happened to them. Knight and Michael say high-profile cases like the Catholic Church scandal, the Jerry Sandusky case at Penn State, and more recently, the case of Larry Nassar, the U.S. Olympic gymnastics team doctor, not only show the prevalence of the problem, but help generate conversations that need to happen no matter how uncomfortable they may be.
And that's why I'm doing this work, and that's why Knight is doing this work, to add our voices to this larger conversation. Because it's in telling the story, telling the truth, that we begin to heal as a society. And as with forgiveness, it's a journey. It's not just one single act. It's the work of a lifetime. It's a long conversation, but it's a conversation worth having.